There's a moment, and most people only get one, maybe two in a lifetime, when the thing you were told to throw away turns out to be the only thing that was ever worth keeping. I've been around long enough to know that the world has a cruel sense of humor. It laughs loudest at the man who holds on when everyone else tells him to let go. It points fingers, it whispers behind weathered hands, it makes bets at the feed store counter about how long before a stubborn fool finally admits defeat. They laughed at Colt Deering for 3 years straight. They laughed at his broken-down truck, his crumbling fence line, at the way he still wore his father's old canvas jacket even after the elbows wore through. They laughed at his inheritance, 112 acres of rocky, half-dead West Texas scrubland, and one ancient, gray-muzzled donkey named Peso that walked with a limp and brayed at the moon like it owed him money. They laughed, and I watched. I'm not proud of it, that's the honest part. I watched from my stool at Me's diner. I watched from across the church parking lot. I watched from behind the wheel of my truck when I'd slow down on Route 9 and see Colt out there in the field, talking to that donkey like the animal actually understood every word. My name is Harlan Webb. I'm 53 years old. I carry a pocket notebook everywhere I go because I can't trust my own memory anymore. And for the better part of 3 years, I was one of the quiet laughers. This is what I owe Colt Deering. This is what I owe myself. What follows isn't a story about a donkey working miracles. It isn't a fable dressed up in cowboy boots. It's something harder than that. It's the story of a man who got handed the ugliest, most laughable inheritance in Cutler County, Texas, and who refused, against every reasonable piece of evidence, to believe it was worthless. It's the story of what happened when he turned out to be right. And it's the story of what that cost him, and the rest of us, before the truth finally surfaced. The first time I ever saw Colt Deering up close, not from a distance, not from the diner window, but actually close enough to count the lines around his eyes, was on a Tuesday in November when the sky over Cutler County had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind was blowing cold off the caprock like it had a grudge against anyone foolish enough to still be standing outside. He was at the property line of his father's land, his land now, I reminded myself, though the distinction still felt strange to most people in town. And he was stringing new wire along a post that looked like it had been leaning at roughly 45 degrees since the Eisenhower administration. He had the wire stretcher in both hands, working it slow and deliberate, and Peso was standing about 12 feet behind him in the scrub grass, watching the whole operation with the particular expression of deep, ancient skepticism that only old donkeys seem to be able to achieve. I'd pulled over because one of my tires had been making a sound I didn't trust, and I was standing outside my truck checking it when Colt looked up and saw me. He didn't wave, he just looked, the way a man looks at a stranger who's parked on the road outside his property, measuring neutral, not quite unfriendly. Then he went back to the wire. I crouched down by my tire, which turned out to be fine, and I probably should have gotten back in my truck right then. But I stayed crouched there for a moment longer than necessary because I was, if I'm being honest, trying to get a longer look at a man I'd been hearing about and half laughing about for 2 years without ever actually speaking to. Colt Deering had come back to Cutler County 14 months earlier, after his father, Roy Deering, died of a stroke in early September of the previous year. Roy Deering had been what people in Cutler County charitably called a character, and less charitably called a stubborn, hard-headed man who never met a sensible decision he didn't refuse to make. Roy had spent 40 years running cattle on 112 acres of land that the county assessor's office had been quietly devaluing for the better part of 2 decades, had resisted every offer from the neighboring ranches to buy him out, had refused to drill for water in the locations that the Geological Survey had recommended, and this is the part that made the feed store crowd shake their heads most vigorously, spent the last 8 years of his life raising exactly one animal on that entire property. One donkey, a gray-muzzled, Roman-nosed, lop-eared donkey named Peso, whom Roy had bought from a livestock sale in Midland for $40 when Peso was already elderly and half-lame, and who had lived in the Deering barn ever since, eating Roy's hay, drinking Roy's well water, and providing absolutely nothing of any economic value to anyone at any time, as far as anyone could determine. Roy Deering had no wife. His wife, Alina, had died 22 years earlier of cancer. He had one son, Colt, who had left Cutler County at 19 to work oil fields in the Permian Basin, had drifted through various states and various trades, roughnecking, fencing, some seasonal ranch work in Montana, and had not been back to see his father, as far as anyone in town could remember, in nearly 7 years before Roy died. The will, when it was read, was simple. Colt got everything. The 112 acres, the crumbling farmhouse, the barn with the rotting loft boards, the 2 remaining fence lines that were still technically standing, a 2003 Ford F-250 with a transmission that slipped in 3rd gear, and Peso. I remember the day the will was discussed at me's diner, because I was sitting 2 stools down from Bill Prout, who knew the county clerk personally and had no compunction about sharing information that was theoretically private, and Bill had leaned back on his stool and said, with genuine satisfaction in his voice, "That boy drove 1,000 miles to inherit a broke-down donkey and a tax bill." People had laughed. I had laughed. I'm writing that down because I think it's important not to let myself pretend otherwise. The thing about watching a man from a distance is that you fill in the gaps with your own assumptions. You see a beat-up truck on a crumbling property, and you decide you know the whole story. You see a man talking to a donkey in a scrubland field, and you construct a narrative around it. Loneliness, poor judgment. A certain weakness of character that allowed him to end up in circumstances that you, with your better decisions and your reasonable life, would never find yourself in. That's what I had done with Colt Deering for 14 months. I had constructed a narrative. The problem with narratives is that they're the stories we tell about other people's lives, and they're almost always wrong about the inside of things. Standing by my truck that Tuesday, watching Colt work the wire stretcher with steady, calloused hands, I had the first uncomfortable sense that my narrative might not be entirely accurate. There was something in the way he worked, unhurried but not slow, precise but not careful in the way of someone worried about being watched, that suggested a man who had made his peace with something. I couldn't have told you what. I just felt it, the way you feel a change in weather before you can smell it. Peso, behind him, lifted his gray muzzle and looked at me. Donkeys have eyes that are disconcerting in their intelligence. Not horse intelligent, which is a quick, nervous, flighty sort of smart. Donkey intelligent is slower, older, like being evaluated by something that has been around a great deal longer than you and finds the results of its evaluation only mildly interesting. Peso looked at me for about 4 seconds, decided I was neither a threat nor worth further attention, and dropped his head back to the scrub grass. Colt finished tying off the wire, stood up, rolled his shoulders, and looked at the post. It still leaned at roughly 38 degrees, which was a marginal improvement. He looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man calculating whether the effort was worth the result, apparently decided it was sufficient, and bent to pick up his tools. That was when he looked over at me again. "Tire all right?" he called. "Yeah," I said, "thanks." He nodded, went back to picking up tools. I should have gotten in my truck. Instead, I heard myself say, "You're Colt Deering." He looked up again, not surprised, just acknowledging. "That's right. Harlan Webb, I knew your father some. Not well, we were at church the same years before he stopped going." Colt's face didn't change in a way I could read. He just said, "He stopped going a long time ago." "He did," I agreed. There was the particular silence of 2 men on a Texas road in November wind who don't know each other and are trying to decide whether to remedy that. I've been in that silence hundreds of times. Usually I leave it alone. "That's quite a fence post," I said. I don't know why I said it. It wasn't clever. It was just honest. The post was genuinely, impressively bad. Colt looked at it again, then the corner of his mouth moved just barely. "I've got 47 more like it," he said. "That one's actually one of the better ones." I looked at the post, then at the fence line receding into the scrub toward the horizon. "Hell," I said. "Yeah," said Colt. And that was how we met. I didn't stop again at his property for another 3 weeks, but I thought about that conversation more than I should have, in the small hours when I lay awake running through things that don't resolve. I thought about a man inheriting 47 fence posts worse than the one I'd seen. I thought about 112 acres of rocky hardscrabble. I thought about the way he'd looked at it, not defeated, not resigned exactly, but with the expression of a man who had taken full inventory of a bad situation, and had not yet decided what to do about it, but was refusing to look away. My pocket notebook from that period has about 4 lines about Colt Deering in it, which tells me I was thinking about him more than I was willing to admit even to myself. The town, meanwhile, had not softened in its opinion. Cutler County is not a cruel place. I want to be clear about that. There are good people here, generous people, people who show up with casseroles and who give a man the shirt off their back in a genuine emergency. But it is a small place with a long memory and a particular wariness of what it perceives as lost causes. And Colt Deering, arriving in a slipping transmission truck to claim a broken property and a lame donkey, had been filed under that category almost immediately. He should sell to the Hargrove outfit, was the most common opinion at Mies. The Hargrove Ranch owned the land to the west and south of the Deering property, and Dale Hargrove had made an offer to Roy Deering at least twice in the last decade, offers that Roy had declined in ways that reportedly involved colorful language. The assumption now was that the son would be more practical than the father. "He's still out there," Bill Pruitt reported, about 6 weeks after Colt's arrival, with the tone of a man reporting an unexpected weather event. "Working on that north fence line." "What's he planning to do with it?" someone asked. "Nobody knows. He doesn't talk much." "Smart man," said me herself from behind the counter, which made people laugh and also effectively ended the conversation, because me had a way of doing that. I wrote "smart man" in my notebook that evening and put a small star next to it, for reasons I didn't fully understand. It was the donkey that brought me back. Not in any mystical way. I'm not the type for mystical explanations, which is one reason I keep a notebook, to force things into the concrete. It was practical. I had a cousin outside of Pico's who raised burros for pack work and trail use, and I'd heard him mention once some technique involving donkeys detecting certain types of ground condition. I couldn't remember the details. I was driving past Route 9 with a different tire issue. I have genuinely bad luck with tires, and I stopped, and Peso was out in the field without Colt visible, and I stood at the fence line watching that old donkey walk the scrubland, and I thought about what I half remembered my cousin saying, and I thought about rocky hardscrabble acres, and some gear turned in my head that hadn't turned before. I wrote one line in my notebook: "Donkeys can smell water, look this up." I looked it up. It turned out to be considerably more complicated and more interesting than that single line suggested. Donkeys do have an exceptional capacity for sensing subsurface moisture. It's why they were used historically in arid regions, why traditional pastoral communities in North Africa and the Middle East relied on them not merely as pack animals, but as navigational tools. More specifically, I found, after 2 evenings of reading that I told myself was just idle curiosity, that a particular type of donkey bred across several generations in arid terrain could demonstrate behavioral cues when crossing ground with subsurface water at relatively shallow depths. Changes in gait, particular vocalizations, a tendency to paw or circle. I thought about Peso walking with a limp. I thought about the geological survey that Roy Deering had refused to follow. I thought about 112 rocky acres that everyone in the county had written off as nearly worthless. And I thought, no, that's too much. That's the kind of thinking that makes fools out of sensible men. I closed my notebook and went to bed. I was at Mies' diner 10 days later when Dale Hargrove came in. Dale Hargrove is 61 years old, built like a man who has never in his life done anything without being confident he was correct. And he has the kind of rancher's authority that comes not from being particularly smart, but from being consistent and patient, and from having started with more land than most people, and having added to it steadily for 30 years. He bought his coffee at the counter, and he sat 2 stools from me, and he talked to Bill Pruitt about the Deering property for about 15 minutes while I read the agricultural supplement of the county paper, and wrote nothing in my notebook, and listened to every word. "Made him an offer last week," Hargrove said. "Reasonable one, better than reasonable." "What'd he say?" Pruitt asked. Hargrove's jaw moved, said he'd think about it. That's what his father always said. His father was an eccentric. I'm hoping the son has more sense. Hargrove drank his coffee. "Can't be doing much with it. I drove past the other day. He's fixed some fence, that's about all. Still got that old donkey out there." "Peso," someone down the counter supplied. "Whatever it's called." Hargrove set his cup down. Rocky ground, bad water table, undersized acreage. What's he going to run on it? Can't carry cattle in any serious number, can't grow anything. Land's been half dead for 20 years. Roy thought it was worth keeping, me said, refilling Hargrove's cup without being asked, which was the closest thing to commentary she offered. Hargrove looked at the cup. Roy Deering was a stubborn old man who died owing 2 years of property taxes, he said, not unkindly. The son can either learn from that or repeat it. Nobody argued. I wrote in my notebook under the table, half dead, bad water table, according to who. That afternoon, I drove out to the Deering property. Not for any reason I'd been able to fully articulate to myself. I told myself I was checking on my cousin's fence repair schedule, which was partially true. I told myself it was on the way, which was partially untrue. I drove past the leaning fence posts on Route 9, and I turned in at the dirt track that led to the farmhouse, and I sat in my truck for a moment in the yard with the engine idling, feeling the particular awkwardness of a man who has arrived somewhere without a solid reason. Colt came out of the barn. He had oil on his hands, the old truck, I guessed, and he looked at my truck the way he'd looked at me on the road, measuring, neutral. Then he recognized me, and his expression shifted a fraction toward something that might have been mildly curious. "Harlan Webb," he said. "Colt," I got out of the truck. "Sorry to bother you." Not bothering me. We stood in the yard, and the wind moved through the scrub around us, and somewhere from the direction of the field I could hear Peso vocalizing. Not a full bray. More of a low, rhythmic grunt rumble that I'd later learn was what Peso did when he was investigating something that held his interest. "You eat yet?" Colt asked. He said it the way ranch people offer hospitality, not with warmth exactly, but with the practical acknowledgement that food is food and people need it, and sharing it is the done thing. I said no, and he said there was coffee and some bread that wasn't stale yet, and I followed him into the farmhouse. The inside of the Deering farmhouse was not what I'd expected, though I couldn't have told you precisely what I had expected. It was small and sparsely furnished, a man living out of whatever his father had left and whatever he'd brought in a single truck load. But it was clean, and there were books. Actual books, stacked on the kitchen table and in a crate against the wall, and this surprised me enough that I looked at them more than was polite. Field geology, hydrology, Southwest land management. Some novels, Cormac McCarthy, a battered copy of Lonesome Dove, what looked like a Spanish-language paperback I couldn't read the title of. Colt watched me looking at the books and said nothing. I sat at the kitchen table, and he poured coffee from a battered percolator, and he sat across from me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "Hargrove made you an offer," I said. He looked at me. "Word gets around." "Always does." He turned his coffee cup between his hands. His hands were very calloused, deeply so, in the way of a man who has worked with them every year of his adult life without interruption. "He made a fair offer," Colt said. "Probably a generous one, considering what people think the land is worth." "Considering what people think," I repeated. He glanced at me, just a glance, but it was a different quality than the neutral assessments I'd gotten from him before. This one was sharper. "You're curious about something?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm curious about most things," I said. "Occupational habit. I spent 20 years as a surveyor before my knees gave out." Something shifted in his face at the word surveyor, and I made a note of that. "I've been reading about burrows," I said, "and subsurface hydrology." The silence that followed had a different texture than the previous ones. Peso brayed from the field, once full-throated, loud enough to carry clearly through the old walls. Colt looked at the window for a moment, then back at me. He picked up his coffee cup, put it down without drinking, and said, "My father spent the last 4 years of his life following that donkey around with a stick." I waited. "Marking spots," Colt said, "where Peso would circle, where he'd paw. Where he'd make that sound he makes." He looked at his hands. "People thought he'd gone soft in the head. Maybe he had, but he filled a whole notebook." "Do you still have it?" I asked. Colt got up from the table, went to the crate of books, reached behind them, and brought out a composition notebook. The kind children use in school, black and white marbled cover, and set it on the table between us. I looked at it. I did not pick it up. "Have you had anybody look at it?" I asked. "One person," he said. "A geology professor over in Odessa about 6 weeks ago. She said—" He stopped, picked up his coffee. She said it was the most thorough, informal behavioral mapping she'd ever seen from a non-professional. The way he said it, careful, like a man who had been told something important and was not yet ready to believe it fully but was not willing to dismiss it either, made the gear in my head turn again harder. "What else did she say?" I asked. Outside, Peso made the low rumbling sound again, closer now, as if he'd drifted toward the house. Colt looked at the window, then at me. "She said if even 3 of the cluster sites check out," he said, "there's water under this land that nobody's ever mapped." The November wind hit the side of the house and the old boards creaked, and in the field Peso made his sound, slow and rhythmic, as if he'd been making it for years and was prepared to keep making it for years more. Patient the way only very old and very certain things are patient. I opened my notebook. "Tell me about the cluster sites," I said. "We talked for 3 hours. I don't usually talk to people for 3 hours. I'm not a conversational person by nature. I'm an observer, a note-taker, a man who prefers the written record over the spoken one." But Colt Deering was not a conversational person either, and there is something about 2 non-conversational people talking that paradoxically makes for more honest exchange than 2 people who are naturally gregarious. There's no performance, no filling of silence for its own sake, just the thing itself. Roy Deering's notebook was meticulous. I'll give the old man that much, sitting there at his son's kitchen table looking at page after page of careful hand-drawn maps, date notations, behavioral descriptions. Roy had marked Peso's unusual behavioral episodes with a red pen, circles, pawing incidents, extended vocalizations, and he'd done it systematically, seasonally over 4 years. The cluster sites, locations where multiple behavioral episodes had occurred across different seasons, and weather conditions, numbered 11. Of those 11, the geology professor from Odessa had identified 6 as geologically plausible sites for a shallow aquifer. Of those 6, 3 formed a line that corresponded to a fault structure that the County Geological Survey from 1987, the one Roy had supposedly rejected, had actually flagged as a secondary area of interest before focusing its recommendations elsewhere. Roy hadn't rejected the Geological Survey. He'd read it, identified the secondary notation, and spent 4 years having a donkey confirm it empirically. "Your father," I said carefully, "was not what people thought he was." Colt looked at the table. His jaw worked once. "No," he said, "he wasn't." There was something in his voice that I chose not to press on. Not then. The thing between a man and his dead father is private territory, and it deserves to stay that way until the man decides to open the gate. Why haven't you drilled?" I asked, "even one test well?" Colt's hands, flat on the table, pressed down slightly. "Money," he said. "A test well, properly permitted, with a hydrology firm doing the core sampling, you're talking $30,000, $40,000. Minimum." He looked at me. "I came back here with $11,000 in savings and a truck. I've spent about 4 of it keeping the property taxes current and buying wire." I thought about Hargrove's offer. "If you sold to Hargrove," I said, "he wouldn't know what he was buying." "No," said Colt. "And if you told him, he'd renegotiate the offer to reflect it, or he'd pull it entirely and wait me out until I couldn't pay the taxes." His voice was flat, not bitter, just accounting. "Or," I said slowly, turning my coffee cup in my hands, "you find a partner." The word sat between us on the table, like something that had been put there with deliberate care. "I don't know you," Colt said. "No," I said, "you don't." The wind hit the house again. Peso brayed from just outside the window, startlingly close, once clear like a pronouncement. Colt looked at the window, then at me. "Why," he said, "why would you?" I thought about it. I could have said, "Because I spent 14 months laughing at you from a diner stool, and I owe you something for that, though the debt was invisible because you never knew about it." I could have said, "Because I spent 20 years as a surveyor, and I know what it looks like when everyone has missed something important." I could have said, "Because I'm 53 years old and I have good knees and bad ones, and neither have ever been much use to any purpose larger than my own survival, and maybe that's starting to bother me." I said, "Because your father spent 4 years following a donkey around in a field and he turned out to be right, and everybody who laughed at him, including me, deserves to be proved wrong." Colt looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down." I was sitting down. He looked at that too. "I know," I said. And then, for the first time in the 14 months since he'd arrived in Cutler County, Colt Deering almost smiled. I drove home that night in the dark with my notebook open on the passenger seat, filled with numbers and names, and a crooked hand-drawn map of 11 cluster sites on 112 acres of West Texas scrubland. The heater in my truck worked intermittently, and the road back to town was empty, and I drove slowly because I was thinking too hard to drive at any other speed. The thing I kept coming back to was not the geology or the hydrology or even the money, though all of those things were real and needed attention. The thing I kept coming back to was Roy Deering's notebook. 4 years of systematic observation. 4 years of being laughed at politely and impolitely by an entire county, by people at Me's Diner and the feed store and probably the county assessor's office, and continuing anyway, marking red circles, writing dates, following a limping donkey through the scrub at dawn and at dusk and in the cold and in the heat, because he believed that the animal knew something the maps didn't show. There's a kind of stubbornness in that which isn't really stubbornness at all. It's more like faith that has been moved underground, the way water moves underground, finding its own level in the dark, patient and persistent, waiting for someone to drill down far enough to find it. Roy Deering had been waiting. Colt had inherited the weight. And Peso, old, gray-muzzled, Roman-nosed Peso with his lame walk and his moon braying, and his 4 years of mapping the invisible architecture of the earth, had been the instrument of it all along. I wrote in my notebook, parked in my driveway in the dark before going in. The old donkey knew where the water was. The old man knew the donkey knew. The son trusted the old man's knowing, and everybody else just saw a poor man with a broke-down animal on bad land. We were all looking at the wrong thing. I put my pen away and sat in the dark for a minute. Then I went inside and started making phone calls. There is a specific kind of cold that comes to the West Texas high plains in December. Not the dramatic, driving cold of a northern winter, but a thin, persistent cold that gets into everything. That settles into the joints of fence posts and the crevices of old houses and the spaces between a man's ribs where doubt lives. It's the kind of cold that makes you question your choices, not because they were bad choices, but because cold at 2 in the morning has a way of making everything seem provisional. I had made several choices in the 10 days since I'd sat at Colt Deering's kitchen table, and at 2 in the morning in the thin December cold, they felt extremely provisional. I should catalog them. I had called my cousin outside of Pico's, who had more experience with burrows and ground-sensing behavior than anyone else I knew, and who had confirmed, with the careful hedging of a man who didn't want to be held responsible for someone else's decisions, that what Roy Deering had documented was consistent with behavior patterns that serious researchers had recorded in working donkeys in arid zones. I had called a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, the geology professor from Odessa, whose number Colt had given me after considerable deliberation, and who had spoken to me for 45 minutes about the Deering property with the particular enthusiasm of an academic who has found a genuine anomaly and is not entirely certain what to do about it. I had spoken to a licensed water well drilling company based in Midland, and I had spoken to the County Water Authority about permitting timelines, and I had done the math several times in my notebook and then erased the math and done it again. And I had put in 50% of the capital for a test well. $22,000, drawn from a savings account I had been quietly maintaining for 11 years against what I had vaguely described to myself as future opportunities, without ever specifying what I meant by that. Colt had put in the other $22,000, the remainder of his savings, held back from his arrival money. We had signed a simple agreement, drafted by the only attorney in Cutler County who kept weekend hours, which stipulated equal partnership in any commercial development rights that emerged from findings on the property, with Colt retaining full ownership of the land itself. It was either the best decision I had ever made or the worst one, and at 2 in the morning in December I was increasingly convinced it was the worst. My notebook from those 10 days is not enjoyable to reread. It's full of half-calculations and worry fragments and questions without answers and one 3-line entry that simply reads, "What if the donkey was just walking around? What if the donkey was just walking around? What if the donkey was just walking around?" Which was, I think, a genuine concern. The drilling crew arrived on December 14th. 3 men and a truck-mounted rotary rig from the Midland Company, arriving at 7 in the morning when the sky was still gray and the scrub was crystallized with frost. Colt was out in the yard when they arrived. I pulled up 5 minutes later. The lead driller was a man named Soto, 50s, thick through the shoulders, with the permanently squinting expression of someone who has spent most of his career looking at the horizon or the ground, and has decided that both are more interesting than people. He shook hands with Colt, shook hands with me, looked at the composition notebook with Roy's marked cluster sites, and examined the map with the expression of a doctor reviewing a chart that an untrained person has assembled. Respectful, professionally neutral, privately skeptical. First sight, he said, tapping the cluster on the northwest corner. Rock type. Caliche over limestone, Colt said, at least in the top layer. Soto nodded slowly. We'll start there. What followed was not exciting in the way that you might hope things to be when you have invested your entire provisional savings account into them. Drilling is loud, louder than I'd expected. A sustained mechanical roar that sent Peso retreating to the far end of the field and kept him there, watching from a distance with his ears angled forward and his expression somewhere between offended and philosophically resigned. It raises dust and it proceeds in increments of feet, and it involves a great deal of standing and watching and recalibrating your sense of time, because the Earth does not give up its information on any schedule that is convenient for humans standing in the cold waiting for it. Colt and I stood near the fence line and drank coffee from a thermos and said almost nothing to each other for most of the morning. Around 11 o'clock, Soto walked over to us. He had mud on his jacket and an expression that I could not read. 60 feet, he said. We're in a fracture zone. There's moisture in the core samples. I made myself not react visibly. Colt's jaw tightened once. Good, I asked. Too early to say good, Soto said. Keep drilling. We kept drilling. At 85 feet, they hit water. I need to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because there is a version of it that sounds too easy, too cinematic. The water comes up, everyone cheers, the music swells, and that version is not what actually happened. What actually happened was considerably quieter and considerably more complicated and considerably less immediately triumphant. What happened was, Soto's equipment registered significant pressure, and he and his crew went through 45 minutes of technical procedures I couldn't follow, and eventually Soto walked back over to us and stood in the December cold and said, You've got water. Pressure's good. Better than good, actually. I'd call it strong. He looked at Colt. Your father's marks on that map, the other cluster sites. 5 of them in the northwest quadrant, Colt said. Soto nodded once. I'd test those. And then he went back to his equipment, because that was the nature of the man. He went to the information rather than dwelling in the moment of it. I looked at Colt. Colt was looking at the rig. After a long time, he said, he knew. Not triumphantly, not with relief exactly. He said it the way you say something that has been true for years and has just been confirmed, with a kind of heaviness that is also a kind of release, the two things happening simultaneously. He knew, I agreed. Peso across the field lifted his gray muzzle and brayed once, loud and clear and long, the full voice of him, carrying over the cold scrubland and the sound of the drilling rig and the West Texas wind. It was undoubtedly coincidental. I wrote it down anyway because I keep a notebook and I write down what I see. We tested 4 of the 5 remaining northwest cluster sites over the next 8 days. 3 of them produced water. The 4th was dry, 40 feet of caliche, and then fractured limestone with no significant moisture. And I noted with a certain grim respect that Roy Deering had marked it with a single circle in his notebook, rather than the double circle notation he used for sites where Peso had shown repeated behavioral cues across multiple visits. Roy had believed in his data enough to track confidence levels. Dr. Patricia Voss drove out from Odessa on the 2nd weekend. She was younger than I'd expected from her voice on the phone, early 40s, with short gray hair, and the habit of crouching down to look at things at ground level that she shared with experienced geologists and small children. She spent an afternoon with Soto's core samples and Roy's notebook and the site maps, and she sat at Colt's kitchen table that evening with her own notebook open and wrote for a long time without speaking. Finally, she said, "This is a coherent system. These aren't isolated pockets. The northwest cluster and probably the central cluster if those test out, they're drawing from the same formation. A paleo channel, most likely. Sealed by Caliche before the survey instruments of the 80s could map it properly. How significant? I asked. She looked at me, then at Colt. Significant enough that I'm going to ask to include this in a paper, she said, with your permission. Commercial potential? Colt asked. She wrote a number on a piece of paper and turned it around and pushed it across the table. I looked at it. My handwriting in my notebook later that night reproduces it, underlined twice. It was not a small number. I looked at Colt. Colt looked at the number. Then he looked out the window toward the dark field, where Peso was somewhere invisible in the night. My father, he said, sold his tractor in 2019 to pay property taxes. He said it quietly to no one in particular. He walked behind that donkey every morning in July heat, every November cold. People drove by on the highway and they saw an old man chasing a lame donkey around a dead field. He paused. Nobody stopped. Nobody said anything. I didn't stop, Colt said. 7 years I didn't come back. There it was, the thing I'd been sensing behind the door of their conversation all along. The inside of something. The weight inside the inheritance that wasn't about land or water rights or geology. Dr. Voss looked at her notebook. I looked at mine. We were both, I think, trying to give Colt the silence the moment required without making the silence feel like abandonment. He left me the notebook, Colt said after a while. In the will, specifically, the composition notebook, my name on a sticky note on the front. His hands were flat on the table. I almost didn't come back after the call about him dying. I almost called the county and told them to handle the estate. He looked at his hands. I don't know why I didn't. Outside, very faintly, Peso brayed, the low rumbling sound, not the full voice, just the rhythm of his presence in the dark field. You came back, I said. Colt's jaw worked, too late to matter. I'm not sure that's accurate, Dr. Voss said gently. He looked at her. She gestured briefly at the table, at the notebook, the site maps, the core sample reports, the number she'd written on the piece of paper. If you hadn't come back, she said, none of this would be mapped. The land would have gone to Hargrove's outfit or to the county, and the aquifer would still be unknown and unexploited for another 20 years, maybe longer. Your father did the work, but he needed you to complete it. Colt looked at the table for a long time. He needed me to come back, he said. Yes. Another long silence. The wind moved the bare branches of the single mesquite tree outside the kitchen window, and the shadows moved on the wall, and Peso made his sound in the dark, steady as a tide. I should have come back sooner, Colt said. Yes, Dr. Voss said again. She said it without cruelty, just truth, the plain kind, which is the only kind that actually helps. Colt looked at her. Then something in his face, very subtly, very slowly, rearranged itself. Not into peace exactly. Into something that is adjacent to peace, the preliminary state of it, when a person has faced the actual shape of what they carry and found that it has edges they can see. He picked up his coffee cup. Tell me about the paper, he said. I should record what happened with Dale Hargrove, because it's part of the story and leaving it out would be selective in a way I don't think the story deserves. Hargrove found out, as people find out things in small counties, which is to say through a combination of the drilling crew stopping at Me's for lunch and Bill Prute's entirely reliable capacity for information gathering. He called Colt 3 days after Soto's initial finding. I know because Colt told me, standing in the cold by the fence line, with the kind of neutrality that a man uses when he is reporting something that could have been a threat and turned out to be something else. He wants to renegotiate, Colt said. Of course he does. Offered a number that's considerably higher than the first one. I waited. I told him the land wasn't for sale, Colt said, but that if the water rights situation developed in a direction that made a partnership beneficial, I'd reach out. I thought about that. He took that well. No, Colt said. He didn't. He paused. He said my father wasted 40 years on a dead property and that I was making the same mistake. The wind moved through the scrub. What did you say? I asked. Colt looked at the field. Peso was at the northwest corner, near the test well site, which he'd taken to standing by in the mornings with the expression of an old professor revisiting a proof he'd worked out long ago. I said, Colt told me, That my father spent 40 years investing in information that everyone else was too sure of themselves to look for. He glanced at me. Hargrove hung up. I wrote it down. The story of the water rights, the aquifer documentation, the legal process of establishing commercial water use permits in a Texas county in the middle of a decadal drought. All of that is important, but it is also the kind of story that would require another notebook entirely, full of meeting minutes and regulatory filings and conversations with water law attorneys who charged by the 6-minute increment. I'm going to skip the mechanics because the mechanics, while real, are not the inside of the story. The inside of the story was what happened to Colt Deering in the weeks between the confirmation of the first well and the beginning of the permitting process, when the material situation had shifted dramatically, but nothing had actually changed yet. No income, no pipeline, no formal agreements, just the knowledge of what the land held and the slow grinding process of converting that knowledge into something the world would recognize as real. What happened was, the town found out. And the town, being a small town with a long memory and a genuine wariness of looking foolish, had a complicated time of it. Me changed first. Me was like that. She had a weather-vane quality, not in the sense of being indecisive, but in the sense of being correctly calibrated to actual reality rather than the social consensus about reality. The day after Bill Pruitt announced what he'd gathered about the drilling results, me put a piece of pecan pie in front of Colt when he came in for coffee and said, "Your father used to say that donkey had more sense than most people. I believe he was right." And she went back behind the counter. That was all she said, but at me's diner it was equivalent to a proclamation. Bill Pruitt managed the information with the particular agility of a person who has been wrong about something publicly, and is attempting to relocate himself on the right side of history without drawing attention to the repositioning. He said things like, "I always thought Roy was onto something, and wouldn't have surprised me one bit," and he said them with the confidence of a man who has convinced himself retroactively that this was his position all along. Others were less graceful about it. A man named Harlan Webb, no relation to me, came out to the Deering property one afternoon when I was there and stood in the yard and said directly to Colt, "I told everybody you were wasting your time out here. I want you to know I was wrong." He said it stiffly, the way a man says something he has rehearsed because he has decided it is the right thing to do despite the fact that it costs him something. Colt shook his hand. Harlan Webb drove away. I noted that exchange carefully in my notebook because it seemed important, not the content of it but the quality of it, the effortfulness, the way decency sometimes looks like it's occurring against the person's natural instincts, which I think is actually the truest form of it. Hargrove didn't come out. Hargrove sent his ranch manager to ask, politely, whether Colt had reconsidered the sale. Colt said no. The ranch manager drove away. It was during this intermediate period, the knowledge without the resolution, the validation without the completion, that I think I came to understand something about Colt Deering that I hadn't understood in all the weeks of driving past his fence line and the 3 hours at his kitchen table, and the days standing beside him in the cold watching drill cores come up from the earth. He wasn't happy, not in the way I'd have expected, not in the way any reasonable person might expect after the thing they've been working toward begins to become real. He was steady, he was focused. He worked the fence line and he fed Peso, and he had the phone calls with the attorneys and the water authority, and he made decisions with the kind of dry precision that had started to feel like his defining characteristic, and none of it looked like happiness. I asked him eventually. It was a Sunday afternoon in late December, cold and bright, both of us sitting on the back steps of the farmhouse with coffee because neither of us had thought to bring chairs outside and neither of us wanted to go back in. "You should feel better than this," I said. He looked at me. "You were right," I said. "Your father was right. The land is worth what he believed it was worth. That's a significant thing, Colt." He drank his coffee, looked at the field, where Peso was standing in a patch of winter sunlight with his eyes half closed and his good ear angled south. "He's been dead for 15 months, Colt said. I let the silence sit. "We had a bad falling out," he said. "Before I stopped coming back, it wasn't one thing, it was years of things. He wanted me to come home, I didn't want to come home, and eventually it just stopped. The calls stopped, the visits." He put both hands around his coffee cup. Last time I talked to him was 2 years before he died. On the phone, 30 minutes, it was all right. It wasn't what it should have been. Peso shifted in his patch of sunlight, resettled his weight. I thought I'd fix it eventually, Colt said. I thought there was going to be time to, he stopped, started again. You always think there's time. I thought about my own life, my own people, my own presumed abundance of time. Yeah, I said. He died knowing I hadn't come back, Colt said. He died following that donkey around, filling in that notebook, and the whole time he was doing it, maybe he was doing it for me, leaving me something to come back to. Something to, he stopped again, his jaw tight. I waited. He left me the notebook, Colt said. With my name on it, he knew I'd come eventually. He trusted that. He was right, I said. I don't know if that makes it better, Colt said, or if it makes it worse. The winter sun moved, and Peso moved with it, 3 steps to stay in the warmth. I wrote nothing in my notebook that evening. Some things don't need to be written down because they won't escape the memory. They settle into the bone and stay there. The permitting process, which I said I'd skip, took 4 months. I'll record the shape of it without the mechanics. It was slow, it was bureaucratically complex. It was frustrating in the specific way of all processes that exist to regulate things that are legitimately important and do so through systems that were designed for different circumstances. The water law attorney cost more than I'd budgeted. There was a counterfiling from Hargrove's legal representation that delayed things by 6 weeks and was ultimately unsuccessful, but was designed, clearly, to make the process painful enough that Colt would consider a buyout instead. He didn't. During those 4 months, 3 things happened that I think belong in any honest account. First, Dr. Voss's paper was accepted by a regional geology journal, crediting Roy Deering's documentation as the primary observational data that identified the aquifer site. The paper's title mentioned the behavioral mapping methodology. In academic terms, it was modest. In the terms of a dead man's 4 years of walking behind a donkey through scrubland, it was, I don't know the right word. Vindication seems too small. I wrote in my notebook, Roy Deering is credited in a peer-reviewed paper. He'll never know. The donkey that helped him get there is still alive and will not read the paper. Both these facts seem important. Second, Peso got sick. It happened in February, not dramatically, a respiratory thing, the kind that takes down older animals with the quiet efficiency of time. The veterinarian from Odessa drove out, examined him, gave Colt medication and instructions and the particular expression of a vet who is managing the situation but cannot promise the outcome. Colt didn't sleep much for the first week. I know because I drove out twice, and the farmhouse lights were on at hours when no reasonable person needed light. Peso recovered, slowly, unevenly, in the way of old animals that have decided they're not done yet. But for 3 weeks in February, the old donkey was genuinely precarious, and watching Colt during those 3 weeks told me more about him than anything that had happened since November. He stayed with Peso through the nights. He administered the medication with the focused care of a man performing a duty that he understands is not transactional. Not I keep this animal healthy so it can help me, but this animal gave my father 4 years and my father is gone, and I am here now and so I will stay. It was loyalty, but not the self-interested kind. It was the other kind, the kind that has no return on it except the thing itself. Peso recovered. Third, the letters. There were 14 of them, found in a shoebox under Roy Deering's bed during the month that Colt was doing the thorough cleaning of the farmhouse that he'd been putting off since his arrival. Letters written to Colt, over 7 years, in Roy Deering's cramped and careful hand, and never sent. 14 letters across 7 years, covering ground that the phone calls hadn't covered and the visits hadn't happened long enough to reach. I know the general shape of their content because Colt told me, one evening, with the economy of a man who is sharing something enormous, and is keeping the words few to maintain his composure. Roy had understood why Colt had left. Roy had understood it in a way he'd never been able to say on the phone, or in the way that fathers who love their sons and don't know how to reach them sometimes can't say, but had apparently been able to write, in the privacy of letters that were composed for an audience of one, and then kept in a shoebox because the fear of sending them, and the fear of the response or lack of response, was larger than the need. The last letter was dated 3 weeks before Roy's stroke. I did not ask Colt what the last letter said. Some things are not for notebooks. What he told me was, He said he'd left me everything he had. He said he was sorry it wasn't more. He said the land knew something the maps didn't show, and that Peso knew the land, and that between the two of them they'd been keeping something safe for me. He paused. He said he'd been keeping it safe for me. The December cold, the thin West Texas light, Peso in his field, gray-muzzled and enduring. A man who spent 40 years on a piece of land that everyone else had written off, following a limping donkey through the scrub, filling a composition notebook with red circle marks, writing letters he never sent to a son he never stopped waiting for. Keeping something safe. I drove home that night and sat in my driveway for a long time and did not write anything in my notebook because there was nothing that needed to be written. It was all there already, assembled in Roy Deering's cramped hand and his 40 years, and his old donkey and his dead sureness about what the earth beneath his feet contained. Some men build things. Some men discover things. Some men spend their lives simply refusing to let something be lost, knowing that if they hold on long enough, the person who is supposed to receive it will eventually arrive. Roy Deering had been that last kind of man. And the inheritance, it turned out, was not the land. By spring, the word had changed. Not the word of the county, that would change more slowly, in the way of all things that require people to revise their understanding of what they were certain they knew. I mean the word inside the thing itself. The atmosphere on the Deering property had changed, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the way that things change when a process that has been underground for a long time finally breaks the surface. There was a quality in the air different from the November cold and the February uncertainty. Something beginning. The first commercial water contract was signed in March. It was not a landmark agreement, a regional agricultural cooperative looking for supplemental water rights during drought years, a modest volume at a reasonable rate, structured carefully by the water law attorney to protect both parties and to ensure the aquifer was being drawn on sustainably. But it was real. It was signed. It had Colt Deering's signature at the bottom and a date, and when Colt brought the copy to the table at me's diner and set it down and ordered coffee, me set the coffee down and put her hand on top of the document for a moment. Just for a moment, briefly, and then went back to the counter without saying a word. I thought that was the most eloquent thing I'd seen all year. Bill Prout was there. He said, "Well, hell of a thing." He said it with genuine warmth, which I appreciated and which partially rehabilitated my opinion of him. I was there too at the counter with my notebook and I wrote, first contract, March 4th. Colt didn't look triumphant, he looked tired, the good kind. The good kind of tired is worth noting because it's different from all the other kinds, and Colt had been through enough of the other kinds to make the distinction legible on his face. There's the tired of fighting something that isn't moving. There's the tired of grieving something that you've been grieving in pieces for years without giving yourself permission to name the grief. There's the tired of maintaining certainty in the presence of everyone's comfortable certainty that you're wrong. All of those tiredness types live differently in a man's body. They round the shoulders differently, they change the depth of the lines around the eyes, they produce different qualities of silence. The tired of having done the work and having the work finally land, that one sits straighter. It doesn't look like victory. It doesn't feel like victory, I think, for people like Colt who have earned the habit of not trusting easy conclusions. But it has a different texture. He was still out there every morning with Peso. Rain or cold or March wind that came off the caprock like it wanted to strip the skin off your face. Peso walked the field with his limping, deliberate gait, and Colt walked beside him or behind him, and sometimes I drove past on Route 9 and saw them, and sometimes I stopped, and sometimes I kept going. There was a rhythm to it now that hadn't been there before. Or rather, there had always been a rhythm, but now I could perceive it differently, now that I understood what the walking meant. Roy Deering had followed Peso for 4 years with a composition notebook. Colt had taken up the walk. He wasn't marking sites anymore. The northwest quadrant was mapped. The central cluster was in process. The geological picture was substantially established. But he walked with the donkey in the mornings anyway, and I think if you had asked him why, he would have said something practical and deflecting, because Colt Deering was not a man who spoke easily about the inside of things, even when the inside of things was exactly what he was attending to. What I think, which I wrote in my notebook one morning in March, he's keeping the old man's walk going, finishing what Roy started. Not for the water is found, for something else, for the keeping of it. The county changed its opinion the way that counties always do. Not all at once, not with any acknowledgement of the change, but through a kind of collective repositioning in which the original consensus quietly ceased to be held and a new one took its place, with no one volunteering to document the transition. The feed store conversations changed. Not dramatically, there wasn't a public reckoning, no gathering at which anyone said, "We were wrong about that boy and his donkey." What happened was more like what happens when the weather changes. You look up one day and it's different, and you can't point to the exact moment when it stopped being the other thing. Colt started getting nodded to at the hardware store in a way that indicated inclusion rather than toleration. He got invited twice, in March and once in April, to the kind of informal rancher talk gatherings that happen at various properties in the county, ostensibly about grazing rotations or fence line disputes or county water authority politics, but actually about the ongoing maintenance of the social fabric that holds a rural community together. He went to one of them. He came back and said it had been all right, and I recorded this in my notebook as a significant indicator of something I didn't have a word for. Dale Hargrove remained notably absent from the repositioning. Hargrove was too experienced and too proud to reposition publicly, and too smart to keep pressing the legal angle once it became clear that it had failed. What he did instead was what powerful men in small counties often do when they have been quietly bested. He waited. Not with hostility. Hargrove wasn't personally hostile, I don't think. He waited with the patience of a man who believes that time has a way of creating opportunities, and that patience is a form of strategy. I wrote in my notebook, "Hargrove is waiting for Colt to need something. That's fine, so is Colt." Peso's health remained the primary uncertainty of the spring. He'd recovered from the February illness, as I mentioned, but the recovery had the character of old animal recoveries, complete in some ways and permanently altered in others. He moved a little slower. He tired more easily on cold mornings. The veterinarian from Odessa made 2 more visits and was consistently cautiously optimistic in the specific way of medical professionals who are trying to be honest without creating more anxiety than is already present. Colt had the vet's number saved under Peso, P-A-S-O, in his phone, which I discovered one afternoon when he pulled it out to call and I saw the name on screen, and which I found more touching than I was entirely prepared for. The transposition of the E and the was not, I was confident, a typo. There was a Saturday in April. I remember it specifically because my notebook has a full page from that day, which is unusual. I'm usually economical. When I arrived at the property in the mid-afternoon and found Colt sitting on the ground in the field, which was not something I had ever seen him do. Sitting, specifically, against the fence post nearest the northwest test well site, with his back to the fence and his legs straight in front of him, and Peso standing beside him with his gray muzzle resting on the top of Colt's head. I stopped walking when I saw them. Peso's eyes were half closed. Colt had one hand raised and was resting it against Peso's neck, not petting him, just contact. The donkey's weight against the man's head, the man's hand against the donkey's neck. I stood at the edge of the field for a minute and did not intrude. What I wrote in my notebook, standing there at the field edge in April. Roy Deering spent 40 years following this donkey through this field. Now his son sits on the ground in the same field with the same donkey's head on his. What is being transmitted here I don't have a category for. Not sentiment, something older. The word for it is probably not in English. I backed away without going closer and made noise on the approach the second time so they'd hear me coming. Colt was on his feet by the time I reached him. Peso didn't move, just stayed where he was, watching me arrive with the mild certainty of an animal that knows the difference between threats and presences. "Afternoon," Colt said. "Afternoon," I said. We walked to the farmhouse and had coffee and discussed the second cooperative contract that was being negotiated, and neither of us mentioned what I'd seen. There was a conversation in May that I have to record even though it's the kind of conversation I'd have preferred not to have been part of, because it exposed something about me that I wasn't proud of, and that I think is relevant to any honest account of this period. We were at Mies, Colt and I and a third person, a younger woman named Rosario who had come down from Lubbock to do some preliminary work on a pipeline easement survey for the cooperative. She was in her early 30s, precise and quick thinking, and she had a habit of asking direct questions that I found refreshing and occasionally uncomfortable. She asked me, "What made you get involved in this in the first place?" I started to say what I usually said: the surveyor background, the geological curiosity, the notebook habit that made me chase down interesting problems. All of it true, none of it the whole truth. Colt was looking at his coffee. I laughed at him, I said. Rosario glanced at me. Not directly to his face, I said. Indirectly, at the diner, with other people. When he first came back with the donkey and the crumbling property, I stopped. I thought what everybody thought, that it was a sad situation and he was going to fail quietly and eventually sell to Hargrove, and that would be that. Colt's expression did not change. "Why are you telling me this?" Rosario asked, not unkindly, just direct. "Because you asked me why I got involved," I said. "And because I keep a notebook and I believe in accurate records, and because I think—" I looked at Colt, who was still looking at his coffee. "I think a person should account for what they actually did, not the better version of it." There was a pause. Colt looked up from his coffee. His eyes met mine for a moment, and something moved through them that I couldn't quite classify, not forgiveness exactly, because I didn't think he'd been holding it against me. I think he'd understood from our first real conversation that I was one of the people who'd been looking from the wrong angle. It was more like recognition. The recognition of a man who has been misjudged by enough people to have stopped expecting anything different, encountering someone who has decided to try to see clearly. "You stopped," he said. "Beg your pardon." "You stopped on the road by the fence." He picked up his coffee. "Most people don't stop." It was, in his economy of words, a substantial thing to say. I wrote it in my notebook under the table. Summer came the way it always comes to West Texas, with a kind of absoluteness, as if it has been planning its arrival for months and is determined to be thorough about it. The scrubland on the Deering property went gold and brittle under the June heat, the kind of heat that makes everything that isn't in shade look slightly unreal. The second cooperative contract signed in June. A third conversation, more serious, more formal, involving Colt's water law attorney and a team from a municipal water authority 80 miles east, was underway by July and proceeding with the careful, measured pace of negotiations in which both parties believed they had something the other needed. The farmhouse roof got repaired. New boards in the barn loft. The transmission on the 2003 Ford finally surrendered completely and was replaced. With a rebuilt unit sourced from a yard in Midland, not a new truck, Colt was not the kind of man to overcorrect. And I noted all of these things in my notebook as indicators of the compound change underway, the gradual solidification of a situation from uncertain to real. Peso got a new stall configuration in the barn, larger, with better airflow, lined with fresh pine shavings instead of the old straw. The veterinarian approved. Peso appeared to neither approve nor disapprove, which the vet said was actually a positive sign in old donkeys. Indifference to change was better than distress. "He's comfortable," the vet said. "That's what matters at his age." "What is his age?" I asked. I'd never been certain. Colt looked at the vet. The vet looked at Peso. "Old," the vet said. "Very, I'd be guessing within a range of 5 years in either direction." She paused. "However old he is, he's still here." That says something. It was in late July that the thing happened which I've been approaching obliquely since the beginning of this account. The thing that I think is actually the center of the story, even though it happened after all the significant events. The wells, the contracts, the repositioning of the county's opinion, the letters in the shoebox, all of it. It was a Tuesday, and I had driven out to the Deering property to review some easement documentation that Rosario had sent for our mutual consideration. And I arrived in the late afternoon to find the property quiet in a way that registered as unusual before I could identify why. No sound from the barn. Colt was sitting on the front steps of the farmhouse, not doing anything, just sitting. I parked and got out, and he looked up at me, and his face was the face of a man who has just received news that he had been preparing for, and had not in fact been prepared for. "Peso," I said. He nodded once. I sat down on the steps beside him. It hadn't been dramatic, that's what he told me eventually in the late afternoon shade. Peso had been in his stall in the morning and Colt had come out to feed him, and the old donkey had been lying down, which he did sometimes but not usually at feeding time, and Colt had known immediately, The way you know immediately with old animals who have been present long enough to have taught you their patterns. Peso had been breathing, but slowly. Colt had sat with him. He'd called the vet, who had come within the hour, but there was nothing to be done by then. The old heart was simply winding down, the way very old things do, without drama or distress. Peso had died at approximately 11 in the morning. Colt had dug the grave himself over the Northwest Test well site, which was, I wrote this in my notebook, either the most natural choice in the world or the most deliberate one, and I was not sure the distinction mattered. We sat on the steps for a long time. The July heat was absolute. The scrubland was golden and still. He would have gone in the field, Colt said eventually. If I'd let him, he always wanted to be in the northwest corner. You buried him there? Yeah. The silence had the texture of aftermath. Not empty, full, in the way of spaces that have recently held something and are still shaped by its having been there. How old do you think he actually was? I asked. The vet guessed at least 28, maybe 32. Colt's hands were on his knees. Dad bought him when he was already old, 8 years ago, so at minimum, he stopped. 28 years minimum, likely older. A donkey bought at a livestock sale in Midland for $40 because Roy Deering had seen something in him, or had needed something from him, or had simply recognized a stubborn old survivor when he encountered one. 4 years of walking, 11 cluster sites, 3 confirmed water sources. An aquifer that had been invisible to every survey instrument, until a lame old donkey with exceptional ground sense traced its boundaries in the patient language of his body. He mapped it all, I said. Every bit of it, Colt said. I looked out at the field, the northwest corner, the slight rise of turned earth where the grave was. Your father bought him because he was already old, I said. Colt looked at the same spot. He wasn't buying an animal, I said. He was buying the animal's knowledge. Everything an animal acquires in decades of living in arid ground. He knew what Peso had learned. Colt was quiet for a long time. He wrote in the notebook, Colt said, about the day he bought him, just a line. I read it 100 times. He paused. He wrote, bought a gray donkey today from a man who didn't know what he had. I sat with that. Roy Deering, buying a donkey from a man who didn't know what he had. A county full of people who didn't know what Roy Deering had. A son who didn't come back for 7 years, and then came back to find that his father had been keeping something safe for him all along. And now Colt Deering, sitting on the steps of the house in the July heat, the northwest corner of the field resting easier than it ever had, the water beneath it found and documented and useful, and the animal that had located it lying in the ground above it, where they had both, in their different ways, always belonged. I know what I had, Colt said. Past tense and present tense simultaneously, not a correction. Not grief exactly, though it was that too. Something that has been understood fully and without evasion for the first time. The Municipal Water Authority contract was signed in September. I should say the number, but I've decided not to, because the number is not the point and never was, and putting it in the account makes it seem like the point, which is the risk of all stories about people who end up materially better than they started. The number was sufficient. The number was enough to restore the farmhouse completely, to carry the property taxes indefinitely, to live on modestly, but without the particular anxiety of a man who is counting months until insolvency. The number was not a fortune, it was enough. Colt, to my knowledge, has not substantially changed his way of life. He still drives the 2003 Ford with the rebuilt transmission. He still wears his father's canvas jacket, though he's had the elbows patched. He still eats at me's more often than he cooks at home, and me still puts his coffee in front of him without being asked, which is the highest form of social recognition available in Cutler County, Texas. He still walks the northwest corner of the field in the mornings. I've driven past on Route 9 enough times to confirm this as a habit, not an occasion. He walks it alone now, and if he marks anything in a notebook, he hasn't told me about it, and I haven't asked. He had a headstone made for Peso's grave. Not large, modest, the size of a foundation stone, gray granite, because that's what the quarry in Odessa had in the right dimensions. It doesn't say anything except the name and a date range that is necessarily approximate at both ends. That last part was not accounted for in the stone carver's standard options. Colt had specified it, and the stone carver had asked what it meant, and Colt had said it meant what it said, and the stone carver, being from Cutler County and therefore capable of reading when explanation is not forthcoming, had carved it accordingly. He knew. I've been trying to figure out, since September, what to make of Roy Deering. Not the public version of Roy Deering, the eccentric, the stubborn, the man who refused sensible advice and died owing taxes, the character who talked to a donkey. The inside version. The man who spent his last years doing something that looked, from every external angle, like foolishness. And that turned out to be the most meticulous, most patient, most profound act of both scientific inquiry and parental love that I've encountered in 53 years of paying attention. He followed a donkey through a field because the donkey knew something the maps didn't show. He wrote 14 letters to his son that he never sent because he loved his son and was afraid. He left the letters in a shoebox and the notebook with his son's name on it and everything else he had in the certainty, not hope, I think. Certainty that the son would come back eventually, and when he did, there would be something worth coming back to. The thing about certainty is that it requires no confirmation. It doesn't need to see the outcome. Roy Deering died before the first well was drilled, before Dr. Voss's paper was published, before the contracts, before Colt walked the northwest corner in the mornings with his hands in the canvas jacket pockets, and his father's composition notebook on the kitchen shelf where the field geology books used to be. Roy died in the knowledge that what he'd done mattered, which is a different thing, a much harder thing, than dying in the certainty that you'll see it matter. And he was right about all three. I told Colt one evening in October that I thought Roy's real inheritance, the thing he'd actually left, beyond the land and the water rights and the composition notebook, was the practice of looking at things that everyone else had decided weren't worth looking at. Colt thought about it for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to respond. Then he said, he used to say that the difference between a fool and a genius is who finds out they were right. I wrote it down. Which was he? I asked. Colt looked at his coffee cup. The October light in the farmhouse was slanted and warm. Outside, the scrubland had gone from gold to bronze, the season changing the way it always does out here, with the indifference of something much larger than human timescales, turning over the calendar of the earth on its own terms. Don't know, Colt said. He died before he found out. I thought about that. Maybe that's the point, I said slowly. He didn't do it to find out. He did it because he believed it. Colt looked at the window. He was both, he said. He was both. Epilogue, though I hesitate to call it that, because nothing about this has the quality of completion that epilogues are supposed to have. Life doesn't have that quality. Things end and other things continue, and the line between them is almost never where you drew it. Colt Deering continues to run the Deering property. He has, as of October, begun quietly, very quietly, investigating the possibility of establishing a small working operation. Not cattle, which the acreage won't support in real numbers, something else. He's been having conversations with a woman who runs a heritage breed livestock program out of a university extension, and those conversations are preliminary and uncertain, and he hasn't told me much about them, which is appropriate since they're his conversations to have. I have retained my $22,000 investment, plus a modest return from the first contract period. I wrote a check for the excess return and gave it to the scholarship fund at the county high school, which seemed like the right size of gesture for what I'd done to earn it, which was stop on a road and look at a fence post and stay long enough to have a conversation. Dr. Patricia Voss's paper was published in January and received, within geological academic circles, considerable attention. She has been back to the Deering property twice since. She and Colt have the kind of relationship that is professionally productive and might be something else as well, though I am not the person to speculate about that in a notebook, and I won't. Bill Prout has entirely convinced himself that he always believed in Roy Deering's project. I have decided to let him have this. Me's diner is exactly the same. The composition notebook, Roy's notebook, with the red circles and the dates and the cluster sites, is on the kitchen shelf of the Deering farmhouse, between the field geology books and the battered copy of Lonesome Dove. I've held it twice. It's lighter than it looks. It has that quality that objects sometimes get when they've been handled with sustained intention for years, a kind of warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. I keep my own notebook, as I always have. In October, I wrote this, which I'm including because it seems like a fair ending to what has been a long and somewhat nonlinear account. Roy Deering did not waste 40 years. Roy Deering spent 40 years on the only thing worth spending 40 years on, which is the patient uncovering of what is real beneath what everyone has decided to believe. He used a donkey to do it, which was either eccentric or brilliant, and the distinction doesn't matter because it worked. He left his son the map. His son came back and followed it. The donkey is buried at the northwest corner over the water he spent his life finding. Everyone who laughed is now adjusting their understanding of what they thought they knew. I was one of the laughers. I'm writing this down so I don't forget. I'm writing this down so that the next time I drive past something that looks like a waste and sounds like a loss and smells like a bad ending, I remember to stop the truck.